A very extremely important hearing because I do believe our economy has a long way to go to reach its full potential. Mr. Boskin, you had mentioned, Dr. Boskin, you had mentioned that the current recovery is about 10 million jobs short. I agree with you overall that we need a strong, credible commitment to serious fiscal consolidation as well as pro-growth tax reform to turn things around. I'm just really discouraged about even CBO recently announcing that unemployment is expected to remain at about 7.5% all the way through 2014, which would be the 6th consecutive year we've had that type of a situation and the longest period in about 70 years. So I guess my overall worry there is that this is being accepted as the new normal. It's being accepted by Congress, it's being accepted by elected officials, it's even being accepted by employers back in my district that understand that this is what's going to happen now. And I'm worried about that because we clearly do have a growth gap that needs to be addressed. And Dr. Goolsbee mentioned bubbles. And I suppose you can look back at the 80s and see the S&L bubble, the 90s of the dot-com bubble, and some would say a housing bubble and mortgage-backed securities bubble of the 2000s. And now I sort of sense some would argue we're in a federal spending bubble. And let me just ask you this, Dr. Boskin, at our current trajectory of spending right now, at what point do you expect investors would begin to lose confidence in the ability of the United States government to back up our debt,
Mr. Paulsen, you're onto something extremely important. Just last week, there was a major paper presented by a former Federal Reserve governor and 3 other distinguished macroeconomists at the Fed, and they concluded that when the debt-GDP ratio, when you look at a variety of historical cases, gets to 80%, and in our net debt, leaving out Social Security, so over the previously accumulated Social Security surplus, whatever we want to make of that, we're a little below that. Our gross debt is well over it. That you run increasing risk of a sudden, abrupt loss of confidence and a dramatic rise in interest rates that requires such a wrenching change in the budget position to become sustainable that you run into these long, depressed growth episodes. That's by former Fed member Rick Mishkin and 3 other prominent macroeconomists. So there's a serious risk. The only honest answer is we can't be sure. But if you're heading toward an iceberg, you ought to change course. You ought not see, well, how close can I get before I make a sharp turn? So it seems to me that we need to start getting the spending curve bending down, and we need to get the debt-GDP ratio not only stabilized, but heading back down to a safety zone, you know, at 50% of GDP or something over the longer term.
Let me ask you this, too, because you just mentioned interest rates and the growing cost of interest rates to the federal government as a part of our budget. As interest rates normalize, at some point they're going to normalize, how much will these payments increase as a part of our national debt? And what are the trade-offs as a larger share of revenues now have to go to actually paying off interest?
Well, that's another important point. I'll let Austin, I don't mean to disrupt Austin's opportunity to answer. I'll turn it to him in a second. CBO projects that the interest costs over the next decade will almost quadruple from somewhat over $200 billion to between $800 and $900 billion a year, both from the higher debt and from higher interest rates. That doesn't include, does not envision one of these abrupt loss of confidence episodes in the meantime, which is possible. It's far from certain, but possible. So the interest payments are going to be crowding out other outlays. They're going to be crowding out other activity. Their higher interest rates will eventually start to crowd out investment, and we need that investment to generate jobs and increases in wages. So it's a serious problem. I think that we've had an unusual period where the Fed, for some good reasons, some not, and I've been very clear that the only grade I can give them so far is an incomplete, because we don't know how they're going to exit from this and what's going to happen. I was a fan of the early policies. I thought they've hit diminishing returns and not been a fan lately. But they've basically replaced the credit markets with themselves, basically deciding to keep interest rates close to zero. And that has enabled the budget to look better than it was. That's not why they did it, but as a byproduct, it's been to make the budget look better than it was. So if we kind of normalize the budget for that, looking what it would look like at closer to full employment, tax revenues would be well above their historic average of GDP at normal employment, for example, and their spending would come down a little bit on things like unemployment, insurance, and so on. So if we looked at that, interest is going to become a big issue, and of course it's increasingly leaving the country. It's a sizable fraction, roughly half, slightly over half, is now held abroad by foreign central banks and pension funds and insurance companies and so on. So it's a big problem, and that's an extra reason we need to get the debt down. But The effect on interest rates will primarily reflect what the budget position is. And number one, is it a surplus, as Mr. Brady mentioned, a primary surplus if we exclude interest. If we get to a primary balance and a surplus, that should take a lot of pressure off this risk of interest rates rising a lot.
Right, thank you. Representative